And we're now live.
Very good. So everybody, my name is Lucy Byatt. I'm Director of Hospitalfield, and I want to welcome you all very warmly to this, our first talk online ever. But this is particularly our first talk from the Stories of Hospitalfield series, which is a series of research projects that we've been doing that emerge out of our archives and really look at the 20th century of Hospitalfield and its emergence as an art school, which was established in 1902 and developed over that long period, changing as it went and as it adapted to the impact of the fashions of the time. It changed, yet so many ways it stayed the same in that it continued to offer time and space for artists to develop their work, and we have with a very strong pedagogical thread that we continue to be inspired to inspire. The thing that has emerged from this research that we've been doing over the last few months and putting up online is the really strong tradition that seemed to have come from the artists who experienced the teaching while they were here and often went off to teach the next generation of artists. So we see George Harcourt, who was the first teacher in what was described as the experimental art school at Hospitalfield. He taught Frank Dobson, who then became head of sculpture at the Royal College. He also taught Austin Cooper, who after becoming a very well-known designer, became the principal of the Roman School of Art in London. And then when James Cowie came in, he then taught a whole nother generation of artists like Joan Erdley, Robert McBride, Robert Colquhoun, and the well-known Irish artist who actually is secretly from Marlborough, Patrick Hennessy. So we see how Hospitalfield impacts the history of art in Scotland and far beyond. And it's incredibly important for us to make visible something that hasn't been visible before, which is this great long line of inspiring artists working very closely with artists. There's one period, 1970s, that is another sort of area where there's very little research. So we've been doing some on the period where Malcolm Fryer was here in the position working with artists, bringing artists to Hospitalfield, and he brought Sir Peter Blake and of course Jann Haworth here together over 3 years, 3 summers. So a very substantial relationship with Hospitalfield, and we're really delighted to welcome Jann Haworth from her studio in the States to talk to us now about that memory, but very particularly about her work and her inspiration. And Cicely Farrar, our program manager here, is going to orchestrate that conversation, be in conversation. So welcome everybody, and I'm handing now over to Cicely and Jann.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And thank you all for attending our first online YouTube in conversation event. Thank you so much to Jann Haworth for joining us. I've had the pleasure over the last few months of getting to know Jann and getting to know her practice, getting to know how she came to be at Hospitalfield and her memories of being here. So our conversation today is very much going to circulate around some of these points of discussion that we've begun. But first, I'd like to introduce Jann Haworth, who it really, for us, it's very special that we get to have this in conversation with Jann. So Jann Haworth is an artist who was born in Hollywood, California. She studied at UCLA, the Slade, and at the Courtauld Institute. She lived in the UK for over 30 years, and she now lives in between Salt Lake City and Sundance. So Jann Haworth first gained acclaim in the 1960s as part of the pop art movement in the UK, in particular for her really iconic soft sculptures, which we'll come to a little bit in the talk, in conversation. She came to Hospitalfield 3 times in the 1970s. We know one of her most acclaimed and famous works was the very renowned collaborative piece that she produced with Sir Peter Blake and the Beatles for the Sgt. Pepper Lonely Heart Club Band cover. She very recently had a big retrospective exhibition called Close Up at Pallant House Gallery, which was earlier this year. As part of that exhibition, and actually in the collection of Pallant House Gallery is her really iconic piece called Mae West. So Jann's got work in major collections in the UK and across the world, including the Tate, the Utah Arts Council England, the Walker Arts Centre, Sao Paulo Museum Brazil, and of course, as I said, Pallant House Gallery. So I will now go into our in conversation. The idea is that we're going to be talking about 3 areas, initially around memories of Hospitalfield, and then approaches to practice, and then a very important contemporary piece that Jann has been working on called the Utah Women Project, which is a major mural project that is going to be launched on the 26th of August later this summer. At the end, we'll have around 15 minutes for questions. We invite you to enter your questions into the YouTube comments section on the right, and then we'll come to these at the end. It would be really super if you could enter your questions as we're speaking, as we're running at a slight time delay. So we'll be receiving them about 20 seconds, 30 seconds after we've been speaking. So over to Jann. Thank you so much for coming this morning, for you this morning, for us this evening. I wanted to ask initially for you to share a little bit about how you came to Hospitalfield and how it was you came here, why you came here, and some of your memories of being at Hospitalfield.
Oh, thank you so much, Lucy and Cicely, for this opportunity. It's lovely to have a chat with you on what is, as you say, a morning here and evening for you guys. We are just entering, a very interesting period, and so to have a chat in this form is certainly appropriate and I think interesting for us all to kind of experience things differently. My time at Hospitalfields was, such a pleasure for me, I have to say. The overarching times I've spent in Scotland, and I've been to Scotland many, many, many times over and above the time I was at Hospitalfields. Scotland for me is very, it was a place of freedom. I won't go into all the details of that, but certainly Hospitalfields occupies that, because the first thing I noticed when I was there is perhaps not the usual first notice, but people were playing volleyball. So that kind of took me back to California. It was the first time that I'd had the opportunity to do a really nasty spinning serve, just clipping the net. And so that was a great liberation and very important to me. Beyond that, Peter was teaching. I wasn't there as a teacher. I was there really with my daughter Liberty on the first visit, later with both my daughters, Libby and Daisy. I had found out that there was agate nearby, and that there were some very interesting geological formations. And I am a rock hound. I've loved geology and geological theory and finding rocks all my life. So that was kind of what went in my suitcase, my rock hammer, my coal chisel, and an attitude. And so I just made a beeline for the beach. And the first morning I walked along the beach, I found jasper. I didn't know it was there. And I do have to tell you that on many subsequent visits, we have been to Auchmuty in depth all day, looking for jasper and looking at the stones there, and really diving deep into the, you know, the subtlety and the beauty of that particular beach. I've never seen anything like it. It's a passion for my daughter, and it's a passion for me. And indeed, it's part of the kind of color range that I use. And oddly enough, it ties very closely to the kind of color range of Utah. So for me, Hospital Fields was about the rocks, the geology, the volleyball, and then also at that point in time, a lot of people were very interested in self-sufficiency, moving back to the country, raising children in a more natural environment. And for me, I was a bit of an expert on finding stuff. Both rocks, but chanterelles and blueberries, which are in abundance in the wood near, well, now I'll tell you. I'll keep that a secret. Anyway, there's a woodland between Arbroath and Auchmickley that is really a super place to go late August, and chanterelles abound there. And actually, you can't have a good chanterelle unless you find it in a beech wood. So you're very lucky. Goes well with Arbroath Smokies too.
So for people that don't know Hospitalfield, Hospitalfield is located on the North Sea, on the coast of in a town called Arbroath, and Auchmickley is a small fishing town with a beautiful pebbled beach, which many artists that come to Hospitalfield will often take walks or travel down maybe to swim, or go to the beaches, or go down and walk around and explore the area.
And I have a painter in Dundee too who has done, you know, paintings of exactly these rocks, just singly or two or three in a painting, and they're very beautiful works. And I think there's a subtle palette there that I think appeals to the artist's eye. But, you know, certainly when you see a jasper rock with bright red fire engine red in it, it's startling. You know, it's an unusual find.
This was one of the things that I've been so kind of excited about and intrigued when talking to you, is some of these practices or some of these things that you've done in terms of the collecting of stones and the collecting of colour in this way. It then influences the palette in your work, as you've described. And I think there were a couple of examples of works that we'd been looking at that came out of, which perhaps we can come to a bit later. One of the stories I really loved that we spoke about was around the raspberry wine that you made.
Well, there were several episodes of raspberry wine, but the first one was, you know, really, it was scrumping. I don't think the farmer would have minded because it was at the end of the picking season, but we took raspberries and then made wine from that. It's just an ordinary country wine recipe: 3 pounds of fruit, gallon of water, your yeast, your airlock, your must, all those things. And that can be looked up online. It makes the most wonderful wine, I have to say. When you drink it, you breathe in to take a sip of it, and the whole of summer just goes up your nose. It's so lovely. And anyway, we got quite good at it. And there were times that I wasn't at Hospital Fields that, you know, we did the same process and kind of had the must in the back of the car going south. As we, you know, picked and began to make the wine. But it's a lovely wine to make, and certainly is not second fiddle, in my opinion, to any grape. It's really, really wonderful. Malcolm, he became completely a fanatic in making country wines. By the last time we were there, he was making wine in dustbins. I mean, huge bins full of wine. I don't think there were even enough people to ever drink it, but it became quite a production. I don't know what happened to it. It may be laid down in some cellar in the house. It might be worth looking.
With this in mind, and with this some of these interests in terms of working with your hands and making, could you tell me a little bit more about what you were doing in your practice at the point of coming to Hospitalfield, and kind of 60s, 70s moment, and then also where you went on from?
Sure. The pop arc through the 60s. I mean, I would say I'm possibly not a pop artist. I don't know what I am. My subjects certainly sometimes, you know, were in the same zone as other people, but they skewed in a different direction. And so setting the context, the pop images are varied in my case. And that elided through the birth of my daughter in '68. And Liberty, you know, was a little puppet, and I was a 100% full-time mom, and doing my work in the evening. I had a show in '71 at Sydney Janis to prepare for, but the intentions of art seemed to shift through the kind of period of the late '60s. And it got very Rococo. I mean, if you look at the Sgt. Pepper cover, it's Rococo. It's very, very decorative. And so the mood had shifted, that people were interested in Art Nouveau and that kind of thing. They were interested in psychedelia and in fairy tales and that kind of thing. We're not there at this point in time. And so it sometimes, I would describe it as looking a bit goopy. What happened for me was I began to make masks. That was a sort of something I could do in the time that I had to work. I also began to do tapestry work because I could pick it up and put it down and have a little girl at my side. And so I began a process of making masks that were three-dimensional. I liked the idea that you know, a three-dimensional mask made in clay could be interesting. I did a head of Macbeth for the Arden Shakespeare series. I did a tapestry for Twelfth Night for another one of the Arden Shakespeare covers. And then I thought off the clay mold, looking at, here you have the Macbeth, I could make a pattern off that face by cutting little pieces that I would then cut together. Everywhere there was a flat plane, I could take the canvas of the tapestry material and remake the three-dimensional face. I mean, it's an arduous process, but I understood how to do it and I did it. And then I would embroider that with wool. And so there are a number of masks that I did like that one. And this was really taking a turn for me because it was going from objective work, like a cowboy, a surfer, those sorts of things, to a more subjective sensibility. I liked the idea that the face became a surface that you could project ideas on, or it might be the thought of someone, or it might be what they are looking at, or in the case of the clown that we just saw, what they were tied into. They were locked in a house. They were, you know, in a domestic situation. So the idea was more subjective and more emotional, which I don't think was so much a part of my thinking in the '60s. So it was a kind of a turning point in my work. There's a lot of work I did in the '70s that I really don't like anymore, but I do like the masks. I am not very keen on the kind of the fantasy ones. I did a mermaid family, and I did a devil, and I did a bunch of fairies, and I don't like those now. But it was certainly of the time and of being a mother to a child and being in the country and making wine and having ducks and chickens and all of that notion of self-sufficiency based on John Seymour's book and you know, things of that sort. So trying to set the stage for the moment in time that it was is a little difficult for us to see in the middle of a pandemic when our world is so strident and so adversarial and unhappy. But call it Rococo, the Rococo period.
And I understand that in the '70s, one of the things that also happened was you were part of a group of artists called the Royalists. Could you just say a little bit more about who the Royalists were and what your involvement was?
Yeah, I think usually they're described in a way that probably is overcomplicated. The idea was there were several painters that we knew that were interested in doing paintings of the countryside, and we thought it might be nice to collaborate on making a journal or some sort of like a quarterly magazine that we knew several writers, John Fletcher and a few other writers that were of interest to us, and we thought we could have written pieces with visuals about the countryside. We'd all moved to the countryside, or indeed some of the painters that were involved had lived in the countryside for quite some time. And so that kind of went to showing together at the Royal Academy and a few other things. It angered a lot of artists, and justifiably so. I think they took it as, you know, a very kind of Marie Antoinette move, and to a certain degree, it could be well accused of that. I think that the concept behind it was simpler than perhaps its press, let's say, and you know, the work that came out of it. Yes, it was work that I would say held up the values of the nature of England and of the United Kingdom, the let's call it the beauty of the countryside. I'm personally not an artist that pursues beauty. I pursue, you know, things that are forgotten and, you know, perhaps on the edge of things more. But I think that would be the concern of the Arnolds and David and Shaw and so forth. So it was an interesting moment.
One of the things, I guess in a way that kind of reminds me of the quote that I found that you'd mentioned of, I think the artist's normal is to see the world in terms of alternatives. And this was something, when we were first talking, I was quite aware of the Ruralists and that you'd been part of this group. But what I was less aware of was that you'd set up, this was also tied to ideas around self-sufficiency and also ideas around education and rethinking and bringing up children, and that actually you set up a school then in 1979, which maybe you could say a little bit more just about, I guess, how you've been involved in education from that point, and then we could move on to talking about the mural, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah. I think the school was something I've been a passionate, you know, studier of educational psychology. You know, reports that were coming out in England at the time of how children might be taught, about the rigors of education as it was seen in England, you know, in the post-war period. And I kept seeing something different, and alternatives are certainly the key word here. I was fascinated by the way my daughter was learning, why the children that she knew were learning. I love the mind of a child, and I felt that in a way that one of the most important creative responsibilities and joys was to work with the creative material of a child's learning process. You were working with the mind and with opportunities and with possibilities. And so I've never separated art teaching as my drudge. It isn't. I love to teach, and I love to be in that mix with people. I don't feel I teach at them, I work with them, and I work with children. I started the Looking Glass School, and then later in Utah was co-founder of a charter school here. It was called Sundance Mountain School, which still is operating in another location. So education has been key to me. It's exactly like my painting process, that you see alternative ways of embodying ideas and transmitting those. So it's the same process, but the sense of England and teaching at the beginning of the 70s was really in crisis, because what happened was that the arts were being downgraded. You know, subsequently, many arts advisors were just disposed of in administration, and you lost, you know, amazing people like Ivan Day, who was this incredible teacher of or advisor in Wiltshire in drama, and of course Ken Robinson was around at that time, and of course we all know his you know, educational notions from his TED Talks. So we were all rubbing shoulders, we were all friends, and I was fascinated by this process. So starting the Looking Glass School, you know, capped the idea of Alice in Wonderland, which was my mother's Bible that she read to me over and over when I was very little. Alice lived in my head, so we called it Looking Glass School, and it was alternative education. The kids would, you know, dress however they wanted to dress. We would vote on whether we had a playtime or finished a math project and had a longer lunchtime. It was, you know, mayhem at different points, and absolute joy at others. It went from 6 pupils to 16, so it's very small. It was a little school. We had a full-time teacher, Brenda Finch, who lives in Bath still, and all the parents taught. So all the parents had either a half day or a full day teaching in the school each week. So we taught everything from Italian to baseball. So it was pretty amazing, and none of them suffered too much. I mean, most of them have degrees, I can tell you. So they seemed very well adjusted. They went back into mainstream later, but yeah.
So off the back of talking a little bit about education, it would be really nice to hear more around your current project, the Utah Women Project, and also, I guess, to work a little bit, understand a little bit more about how you work with other people in collaboration, but also with people to make your projects. So what I can do is, shall I bring up on the screen the work in progress piece?
Yeah, let me just chat through that a bit, because it gives you an idea of what the Utah Women will be like.
Okay, so
there.
This is now on screen.
Okay, just to give a view of what you're looking at, this is the first sort of plateau of the work in progress mural. This was in 2016, and it takes the conceit of the crowd that was in Sgt. Pepper and really revamps it in a whole different direction, but uses the idea of tiling a group of heads with a front row that has full figures. It also makes use of the central circle that we used for the Sgt. Pepper, only this time it's Laura Decker, who went around the world in a sailing boat. She's a Dutch young woman, and I think she was 16 at the time. And so Laura Decker is right in the middle. And that is a sort of unification idea of all these women who are international. The only real editorial I did on this was that there were to be no Utah women. As it was being made in Utah, I didn't want it to get into being too much of a local thing, which is good because now we're doing one that's all Utah women. Anyway, so this was compiled by research that we did. We went on a radio program and took names on the radio program. We did a survey. We went to high schools and asked the students to give us names, and we compiled this huge list of names, and then went into workshop format where we had non-artists working with us who had in many cases never done any artwork before other than maybe in grade school. We went through the stencil graffiti process. This is exactly what Banksy does. You take a photograph, you cut the darks. Anything that is dark, you cut a hole and you make a stencil of that face. So behind me are some of them. Actually, I can show you this one. Daisy did this one yesterday, my daughter. So photograph of Denise Huptalen, who heads up our Slick college here. And that's Daisy's cut on the other side. So in other words, she's cut it from the photograph, and then she's pushed paint through all the holes that were dark. So all the dark is gone from this. So the idea then is that a person has the photographic support, but they still make different decisions on what they consider to be important. They still hold the knife in a different way. So you have all these stylistic differences. If we could bring up the work in progress again, I can point to a couple of things. And so it allows for a very personal statement Some stencils are, as you can see, very, very minimal. Some are very intricate. Some go way off the other end and become something that is really very designed. I don't know, I can't point to it, but if you go up from Laura Decker's head right to the top, there's a head there, Isadora Duncan, and she is by Nathan Florence, and he's an artist, and it's absolutely stunning head. If you go to the left and down, you'll see one that's right on the edge there that's very abstract, a woman who had not done art before, and it's absolutely amazing what she did, the choices that she made, and she went into 2 colors there. So the opportunity here is wonderful because it greets the public and says that you are going to be a part of this project. It allows then for the artist, who is the collage artist, in this case, my daughter, Liberty Blake, to then take these pieces and arrange them in a way that is to do with a tone, or we can't have too many of these very white images. We have to scatter those. We have to interleave them with gray tones and mid-tones. And I think the thing is that the opportunities there for work with people, with your hands, it crosses so many areas. One of the more recent things that people have done in psychology is a technique called EMDR, which is to treat post-traumatic stress syndrome. And one of the things about that is this left-right kind of acquaintance. If you're walking or if you're working with your right and left hand at the same time, it seems to stimulate memories and seems to stimulate the release of trauma. And we find, Libby and I, when we run these workshops over and over again, people will sit and tell stories that come from somewhere very deep down. And it's the most wonderful process. They're able to sit in silence when they want to and concentrate on what they're doing. And yet they'll devolve into storytelling. And so as a community event, it's been such an amazing experience for all of us. And I think maybe teaching is the wrong word. It's just you're enabling. And I think, that process I find absolutely thrilling. I'm a part of it. I'm not, I'm not even the director of it really. So that collaborative zone is one that I really cherish. I love working there.
Could you say a little bit more then about the current mural, the Utah Women mural that you're working on?
Yes, the initial idea with that is that we were approached by Science Bank, Scott Anderson, and the idea was that we were going to create a mural for a 7-story building in the heart of Salt Lake called the Dinwiddie Building. And the Dinwiddie Building is very wide and tall. And the mural is going to be about 90 feet wide and about 55 feet high. And the idea there was to have 9 panels that would hang on the building for an indefinite amount of time, rather than paint on the building. The surface of the building is very rough and peely paint and big bolts on it and things like that. So it'd be very difficult. So we are just at the turning point in that project from the creation of the heads, and we have created 250 heads, the creation of the heads to the actual design and printing process, which is right on right now. And that's why my room looks like it does. And the process there was to be the workshop process, which I've just described. We got 50% through the project and the pandemic hit. An earthquake hit as well, and that was really scary in Utah. And when the dust settled from that and we kind of calmed down and we had our bags by the door to get out for all if in case the aftershocks were something else, I decided that we had to go online. That was pretty obvious. And then I thought that I was as close to Logan or Springdale or Park City or Ephraim as I was to Edinburgh or Milan. And I wrote to various people and said, would you help? I know you're in lockdown. I don't mean to say something frivolous, but I would love to have you participate in this surreal request, which is to do a portrait of a Utah woman. And the first person to answer was Eleonora Rao in Milan. And she was in a very extreme situation because Milan was locked down and it was very terrible. And she couldn't get out to get materials. And but she said yes. And so she did Belle London, who was a madam in the late 1800s, who had an ice cream shop. And over it was her brothel. And then I wrote to Patrick Elliott and said, might you help? And he said yes. And he and his daughter produced one of Maureen O'Hara, who's a wonderful artist here. And they didn't have anything. So they started their stencil work doing it with a felt pen after they'd cut the stencil and the felt pen ran out. And then they used fence paint and they didn't have paper. So they used wallpaper. And so that's that one in the middle there. I don't know if you can see it. Anyway, so I mean, each, there's a story to each of what they could and what they couldn't do and where they could go. And there are now, I think 7 from Edinburgh, and we have one from Sam Madeley in Wales. We have some from Chichester, from Belgium, from Australia, New Zealand, you know, a lot of places. So, yeah.
Would you mind, Jann, showing the full size one, which is very briefly the one that you?
Okay, well I'll excuse myself and then go stand by them. So that is our. Is her head cut off?
No, we can see it.
Okay, that's our former mayor Jackie Biskupski, so that one's one that will go in the front row. And then I did one of this amazing woman who is an activist for the Native American she is she's doing things to do with the loss of and violence of Native American women who are on the reservations. And so it's very much a matter of discussion at this point and activism. And so she's an amazing woman. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing the most recent project in that way. And I understand that you're collaborating on the project with your daughter Liberty and son Alexander as well.
Mm-hmm. And Daisy. Yeah,
and Daisy as well.
Zoe in Edinburgh.
So we're coming to the point actually where we could start taking some questions. So I've noted, I can see that we've had a couple of questions already. We have had one person, Mike Turpey, apologies if I don't get the pronunciation right, is actually, he remembers you from coming to when you came to Hospitalfield and one of your exhibitions in London and latterly in Sundance. And we have a question from an artist called Mandy McIntosh, quite specifically in relationship to murals. So Mandy is asking, in the context of South American history of the mural as a teaching tool, what do you think could be learned from this work?
From the actual process, Mandy, do you mean, or from the actual mural itself? Is it process oriented, or does she mean the existing mural?
I think she means from the mural, the mural as a type of artwork, as a big public artwork. So the idea of a mural, perhaps. I think. Okay. But what we can do is Mandy might type in a few minutes.
Yeah. Okay. I'll be a
we could begin.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I hope I'm speaking to your question. I think as a process for a community, it's really wonderful because, of course, it unites the community in something that I think they find surprising, that they are able to do the stencil graffiti process so easily. So that exact process is incredible. I think finding a way where people feel that they are included. I don't support the idea of the painting by numbers idea, where the artist just says, okay, paint red there. I think you can go deeper. in that experience. And I think the process is very forgiving, that it doesn't matter how simple or how delicate or how whatever the original piece is. A, it can be done over again if the artist doesn't like it. B, it is wonderful to see the kind of transposition from the photograph into something entirely different. And I mean, Liberty is an enormous, fan of the fact of when they go really way away from the photograph. The 20th century art history liberated us from having to be photorealists. I mean, a line by Matisse certainly may not even follow the face of the sitter, but it's a beautiful line. There's a work that was done by Luella Foyle in Chichester, and she did someone called Pat Jones. It looks like a Matisse. It's simplified and has this wonderful line on the nose. And all of this is unexpected. You don't hold the hand of the person making these things. You let it go, and what might be misinterpreted as a mistake in terms of the realism is often the very, very most artistic moment of that particular image, and golden. So I think as an opportunity for an adventure into art, it's wonderful. And we're saying that, yes, everyone is creative, and yes, everyone can do this. Do we have virtuosos in art? Yes, we do. And virtuosos are in this other area where they're obsessed with this all their lives, and they do amazing things. And yes, they should be supported like the great violinist. Yes, we should consider them our shaman of art, but the public is part of that process. And it's like taking your ballet lesson. You may not be a ballerina, but you jolly well appreciate the ballet a lot more because you've done your little tippy toes, little performance.
So I've seen Mandy's actually added another comment. She was talking about she also meant the whole picture. So once the mural is in place, how
tool?
As a teaching tool, yes. Yeah, so maybe even about, you were saying about the app as well.
Oh, I'd love to jump into that, because if you took this into the classroom or into the WI or into any organization and you said, okay, I want you to research a person and that you are going to do a portrait of, we will then take a photograph, or we will find a photograph of this person, and you will cut a stencil, and then we will have both verbal and visual and research and collaborative and all of those things. It means that within the classroom or within a group, you can set the individual up to do the research on a particular person that's of personal interest to them, their grandmother or whatever. And I think therein, you hit all these amazing points. If it's in a classroom, you have kids working together on all of those points of verbal, visual, mathematical, all those things. It unites it into, by topic, it unites it, the core skill sets that children need to learn. And I think that, that kind of process is very organic because it can be local, it can be grandma, and making grandma the center of attention, or it can be historical, or it can be contemporary. And you can, whatever, core idea that you're pursuing, your community, your history, whatever, it can be the vehicle that carries that. And I think that is so much more than Sgt. Pepper ever was. I mean, Sgt. Pepper is glamorous and, full of celebrity and so forth, but it doesn't really push any either political, ethical notions, none of that. And I think as a vehicle, though, this tiling of heads really gives a huge opportunity to people, that is unusual. A portrait is taken to be the most difficult thing to do. And here, somebody who's never done art does that.
Thank you. So I actually had another question myself as well, was in relationship to how you were choosing the women for each project. One of the things that I was particularly wondering about was how you chose the specific image of that person. So which image did you stencil from and why, and so things like at what age they were and how you make those decisions.
Yeah, and that's a tough one. And very often we are confronted with the idea that the headshot, this smiling headshot, particularly here in Utah, as being the way the person wishes to be seen. I want the eccentric shot myself. I want one that has really good dark and light shadowing. To me, as an artist, and I think increasingly people participating in the workshops find, the plain young face is less interesting to cut. I mean, my students at UWE had the same thing. They would bring in things that they were going to draw and get very bored with the Vogue front cover kind of face, and go straight to the library and find an older face or a face that had more character or was wearing glasses or jewelry or, crazy hair. And so what we tend to look for is character, and character is diversity, and character is personality. I'm wearing a mask, I'm wearing a crazy hat, or I've got my nurse's gear on, my operating goggles, and that becomes absolutely fascinating. And you want something that is different. I hope that our minds grow up to this, because we are so consumed by the image of how we're supposed to be looking all the time. And when we actually look deeply, the real interest, the real joy in a face is its individuality and its difference, and its peculiarities. And so messy hair, great. Hat, wonderful. Jewelry, yeah, that's really fun. Bright colors, glasses, anything that differentiates this face from the kind of high school annual. That look is kind of boring. So choice is tough, and I'm sure there are going to be some people that are peeved at my choices. And I have to take responsibility for that.
So I think we've got time for one more question. So Mike Turpey, who was commenting previously, he has a question. His question is, have you found the lockdown situation an advantage while thinking creatively and producing work?
Yeah, and I work, a lot of people want to know that of each other these days, how are you doing with the lockdown? And all of us, I think, have an individual journey there. It's very easily said, hey, lockdown is what artists seek. We seek the ivory tower, we seek isolation, we seek quiet. Our stimulus often is, kind of within our own head. But we have to say that this particular point in time, what would it have been like if we had not had the internet? I could not have finished the project. That's one thing. So that's been a gift. The internet has been a live source of music, of news, of science, of understanding, of lessening and increasing our fears. I live in an exquisitely beautiful state, being here is a joy. We have a low population. It's not unlike Scotland in that we have mountains to look at, like Scotland, and we don't have the sea, but there you go. So lockdown for us, we have been very lucky, and we're in a lucky place. So it has helped me in as much as I, have been able to absolutely focus. And there's no word of a lie. This has been every day since February, really, 7 days a week, intently following what needs to be done on this project. It's a great joy. I am obsessed with it, and I am absolutely consumed by it, as it should be, out of both respect and huge pleasure. And I think the pandemic has not hindered me. It has made a different pathway for the artist, bringing work to my porch in a mask, putting it down on the porch, and the wonderful postman Justin is you know, he is bringing, you know, the work in from you know, Belgium and wherever, and to great joy when it actually makes it through the post. So, you know, it is an extreme circumstance and something we're learning from it. And I hope it changes us. I hope that we saw that pandemic blue sky, and I hope we actually learn something from that that is indelible, you know, that we move forward and really, really make changes to the way we perceive our role in this world. And climate change is right at the top. The virus isn't at the top. Climate change is really. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jann, for your answer. And also thank you, Mike, for that question. I think that question takes us quite nicely into one of the conversations we've had quite a bit around being at Hospitalfield and being in Angus, and your memories of being here, was this act of noticing and how artists notice more. And even we talked about through lockdown how I would say I've noticed the jellyfish on the beach more, or the goslings in the pond in the park. But we talked about that a little bit in relationship to artists noticing as well, and your memories of Hospitalfield. Could you expand a little maybe on that as our concluding?
Sure. I mean, I think the intent view of things, that we could say that during the pandemic, we slowed down and we missed our hugs, and we cared about our environment, and we heard the bird song this spring because we were listening, not because there were more birds, because we were paying attention to our lives. And we mustn't go back to what we consider to be normal. We've got to make some changes. And, you know, it's always the artist's role, the musician's role, to notice the nuances, to notice what hasn't been noticed before, to create something new on the back of the vast amount of music that's been created, the vast amount of visual art that's been created. So you are looking for these oddities. You're looking for the, you know, the rock on the beach that is bright ochre this time, or it's a perfect egg shape that time. And gradually your nuanced vision becomes intent. And it's that being present, you know, it's taking a photograph of a moment and being highly conscious. Can't go back to the habits. We've got to change, you know. And I think, you know, what it is the lending of an art spirit to everybody. And that in a way goes back to the community projects to say, oh, you can do this. And oh, that moment of lifting off the stencil and seeing what you did is shockingly wonderful. And so I think it's paying attention, and paying attention to each other too, you know. Yeah.
Thank you, Jann. And I just had one last question in, which is a nice thing to talk about. So Lucy was asking if you could talk a little bit more about your show coming up in London in the autumn.
Oh, yes.
Art House.
I'm due to have a show at the Cicely Art House this fall. And the subject of that, I'm not going to tell you, but it has to do with some stencil work that I've been doing. And so there'll be that, and some of the March images, which I think you have Inversion or something like that, they will be there. And that's in October. I think it's October 8th was the date that we had set for that. And next week, a show opens here at Modern West Fine Art. And that's a show of women's work. So a lot of women artists locally, and the mural that Liberty did the collages of will be in that show. So we've got that opening, and then that goes to University of Southern Utah SUMA Museum in September. So there's kind of a bundle of things. There are a lot of things that were shut down this year because of the pandemic, and I won't cry over it, but you know, it was going to be a very big year and everything shut. Oh dear. So yeah, but those are going ahead. So SUMA and Modern West, and and the Mayor Gallery. There's one of the old women is at the Mayor at the moment in London. So yeah, busy time.
And as you mentioned, the Mae West piece from the 60s is actually on display permanently in the Pallant House collection.
It is, yeah,
space.
it is,
yeah.
and they have other pieces too, so yeah.
So
and I think Pallant House is reopening, I think they said July, so yeah, they're looking forward to that. And that's a great community center.
So I think we're at the point of conclusion. We're just coming up to 5 to 6. So thank you so much, Jann. Thank you to everyone attending. Thank you, Mandy and Mike, for your questions, and Lucy for your questions also. And thank you all for tuning in online. I wanted to add, and thank you also to Modern West Gallery and Gazzelli Art House, who are representatives of Jann's work. A very quick plug on behalf of Hospitalfield. So this is, of course, our first online event that we've had, but we are going to be doing other online programming as the year comes up. We are currently working on the summer school, which will be happening towards the end of August, September time, for Beer and Berries, which is an event that really looks at local produce and production in Angus and the region. We're going to be running an online talks programme thinking about labour and economies. And then we also regularly run a Monday morning free drawing school workshop, which this week is being run by Jade Montserrat, and next week Mandy McIntosh, which a lot of the thinking around that looks towards the garden and our upcoming developments in the garden. So thank you very much, and we look forward to talking more and seeing you online again soon. So I will now complete the live stream.